So now that we're familiar with the development of the follicle and the ovary, we can discuss the hormonal control of the ovarian cycle. The hormones involved in this regulation are the same as in males: gonadotropin from the hypothalamus, luteinizing hormone, and follicular stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. But the regulation of the ovarian cycle is a bit more involved than in men, though. And we can break it up into 3 different stages: follicular, ovulation, and luteal phases. The follicular phase is when the hypothalamus is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary, which then stimulates follicles to grow. The follicle exhibits negative feedback on the hypothalamus and then the anterior pituitary. The ovulation phase is very short, and it's characterized by a large spike in estradiol, or estrogen, in the follicle, which stimulates the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. This LH surge is what's leading to ovulation of the dominant follicle, which will be the oocyte that is to be fertilized. And this will then, once the secondary oocyte is extruded, resumption of meiosis will occur. Formation of the corpus luteum is also characterized by this ovulation phase. The luteal phase is when the ovulation has already occurred and progesterone spike will occur, and we'll see that on the next slide here too. So as in men, the hypothalamus produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, which signals to the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH, and those travel through the bloodstream to the ovaries where the follicles are, and they stimulate these follicles to produce estradiol, which is just a type of estrogen. This phase of the ovarian cycle, where the tertiary follicles are growing, is known as the follicular phase. The larger and more developed a follicle is, the more estrogen it will produce in response to LH stimulation. As a result, these larger follicles produce large amounts of estradiol, and then systemic estrogen levels increase in the body. Following a classic negative feedback loop, the high levels of estrogen will tell the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus to stop making their secretions. Well, this means that less FSH and LH are going to be stimulating the follicles, which means a lot of the follicles are going to die off. They're not going to be getting the supplementation they need to live. And typically only one follicle will remain, which is called the dominant follicle, and it will survive this reduction in FSH, and that will be the one that is released as an oocyte. When only one dominant follicle remains, it again begins to secrete estrogen, and it secretes so much estrogen, even more than all of the other follicles combined before, that it does an opposite effect on the hypothalamus than it did before. This super high concentration of estradiol or estrogen makes the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone and FSH and LH again, which then make the what is known as the LH surge. So this follicle produces so much estradiol that it initiates a huge push or secretion of LH from the anterior pituitary, and this is what is known as the LH surge that leads to ovulation of the dominant follicle. So it's a very brief stage, but it occurs as a result of this super high increase in LH resulting from estrogen increase in this dominant follicle. The surge of LH also stimulates a change in the granulosa and theca cells that are supporting that follicle at the end after the ovulation has occurred, that corpus luteum. This change in luteinization transforms the collapsed follicle into that new endocrine structure called the corpus luteum. And instead of estrogen, the cells of the corpus luteum produce progesterone, which is critical for the establishment and maintenance of pregnancy. Progesterone triggers negative feedback at the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland, which keeps gonadotropin releasing hormone and FSH and LH secretions low, so that new dominant follicles don't develop at this time, so that we have just one developing or one follicle released at a time to prevent, a bunch of babies happening at once, which is just not realistic for the human biology. So now that we talked about some hormone regulation of the ovarian cycle, we can talk about the uterus. Again, it's a muscular organ that supports and nourishes a growing embryo. The innermost lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. It grows and thickens in response to increased estrogen and progesterone levels. And at the end of the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, progesterone levels decline. And this thinner endometrium ends up bleeding and is called menstruation or menses phase. And so there is a a condition that some women can have called endometriosis. You might have heard of it. It basically means that this endometrium is so thick all the time that it's difficult for implantation to occur for the baby. And so it leads to a more difficult time conceiving a child for women with the condition of endometriosis. There are 3 different uterine cycle phases that are involved in the reproductive system of the female. The menses, just like we just said, is the shedding of the endometriosis, the lining. Due to declining progesterone levels from degraded corpus luteum, these menses are going to shed that lining. Proliferative phase is characterized by an increase in estrogen levels in the follicles that stimulate endometrial growth. And it ends as a result of the LH surge in ovulation. So the proliferation of these follicles doesn't need to happen anymore because we just released an egg. And then the secretory phase begins once the corpus luteum begins secreting progesterone. So it's secretory phase. And it ends once the corpus luteum degrades, and then it restarts this cycle with the shedding of the lining in the menses again, and then proliferating once that is gone as well. So this is a diagram describing that. And so we see over here, notice only one follicle survives out of all of these. It says selection, but that's the one that survived. Makes it until about day 7 of the follicular phase while everything is growing. Our menses, between 0 and 7 of the menstrual cycle, days-wise, the endometrium was shedding its lining, and then now it's increasing again during the proliferative phase, so it's increasing. And then at day 14, the ovulation occurs, and so we can see here our LH surge at the same time as ovulation at about 14. So the LH surge occurs, and then ovulation occurs. And so those estrogen levels led to the LH. Those estrogen levels were increasing because of this one follicle. And so now that we have ovulation occurring, we have no more follicle secreting estrogen anymore. And instead we have the remains of that corpus luteum secreting progesterone. And so that has a higher effect. And then we see the secretory phase here. And progesterone keeps the endometrium growing. And once about 10 days into that, so we look at 24 here, if the baby hasn't been born yet, it starts shedding again. But if the baby was born, this would stay a nice thick layer so that the baby was supported. So be familiar with the hormone fluctuations based on the phase and what each phase of this cycle consists of. And so now when we're looking at the cessation of the menstrual cycle, approximately 50 or 52 years old, obviously it's different with a lot of different women. This is menopause, so it's the female version of andropause. Less follicles are going to be present in the ovaries since they are born with limited quantities. And so when they get older, they start running out of eggs, which means less estrogen is going to be produced, which means less luteinizing hormone and progesterone will be produced as well, based on those feedback cycles we just looked at. There are very clear evident signs of menopause, meaning physically we can see that bleeding isn't occurring anymore. Menses are not occurring because the hormones aren't inducing buildup of that endometrium, let alone shedding of that lining. There are different signs that you can see in behavior, such as irritability and fatigue. A lot of women experience hot flashes because those hormones are helping control different regulatory aspects of the body, anxiety, emotional disturbances. Again, all of these are hormone related. So when you say someone is hormonal, they're actually, if anything, at a deficiency in hormones. So rather than being hormonal and having a lot of hormones going on, they have not enough hormones. And so it's an irregular feeling for them. And so they're experiencing all these various physical deficiencies or changes to their body based on not having those hormones present anymore. There is hormone replacement therapy, such as taking estrogen or progesterone or both. Again, just like in men, there is a risk, and actually even higher risk in women, to develop cancer because of these changing levels. And briefly, we can talk about fertilization. It's when an oocyte and sperm unite to form the zygote. This will occur in the uterine tubes, and then there are cilia lining the inside of these tubes that usher this embryo now over to the uterus, where it can implant in the wall and continue to divide via mitosis to form a fetus and eventually grow into a little baby. And that actually marks the end of our reproductive system lecture, and we'll talk about all these anatomical features a little bit more in depth when we meet in lab.